We are at the Applewood Studio, the workplace of David Holzapfel in Marlboro. Today's interview crew is on audio recorder, Ritter Redfield, on still camera, Sean Von Rensen, and on video camera, Ben Kowalski. Everything's still working, right? Okay. Since we asked you for your biographical information last week, we won't repeat all those questions, but there are a few background questions I'd like to ask you. Then I'd like to ask you questions about your work as a teacher. Where and in what year were you born, and where did you live as a child?
Before I answer that, I would just like to point out that this is not the first time that I've been interviewed by you, Roxanne. Mm-hmm. When was the first time that you interviewed me?
I was in kindergarten.
You were in kindergarten, that's right. And you came up and asked me a lot of embarrassing questions, like what was my favorite color and stuff like that.
Because that's embarrassing.
You drew a great picture of me, which I still have. And will keep. I really do. Yes. Okay, now on with the interview.
Mm-hmm. So,
would you repeat the question, please?
Where and in what year were you born, and where did you live as a child?
I was born in 1950. I was born actually in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and lived for the first 12 years of my life in New Jersey. But in a part of New Jersey that was just woods at that time. Now it's all built up and everything. But so as a kid, I played in the woods most of the time.
What are your parents' names and what were their careers?
My mom was a homemaker, and my dad worked for Esso, which later became Standard Oil, so it was an oil company. He started off as a truck mechanic and worked his way up to being an executive in sales. Yeah.
How many brothers or sisters do you have, and what are their names? Where do they live now?
I have one older brother named Bob and a younger sister named Jane. Bob lives in Tennessee and Jane lives in Washington State, outside of Seattle.
Mm-hmm. What high school did you go to?
I went to 3 different high schools. It just so happened that my dad got transferred or was offered jobs in different places. So I went for 2 years of high school. We were living in Longmeadow, Massachusetts, and we lived there for 3 or 4 years. And so I went to the freshman and sophomore year at Longmeadow High School. Then we moved to Greensboro, North Carolina, and I had my junior year in Greensboro. Then we moved to Rome, Italy, and so I graduated high school from the school that I attended in Rome, the Overseas School of Rome.
What did you do in the summer between high school and college?
Well, traveled around Europe. Traveled around by train. I mean, the thing is, at that time you could get around by train so easily, and when you're a student, you could get student discounts. So a friend came over from the United States, and we went to Germany, France, Italy. Spent a lot of time in Italy because I spoke Italian by that point, so it was easier to get around and to go to more sort of remote places.
What is your partner's name?
Her name is Michelle Chassé. Was her maiden name, Chassé.
Where is she from?
She was born and grew up in Rhode Island.
How did you meet?
We met when we were both students at Marlboro College. She was running a food service. She had been a student for a year and then quit to take a job with the college as running a vegetarian kitchen. on campus, and I had signed up for that. I came into Marlboro College as a junior and was studying Italian literature and poetry.
Mm-hmm. What career has she been involved with?
She has been she's most known as being a wood turner and a wood carver, but she's also a serious farmer and also works in textiles, like this quilt she made and these bags here.
She's made a lot of quilts that I've seen.
Yeah.
How did you always know you wanted to be a teacher?
How did I always know?
Or if you didn't.
Yeah, no, I don't ever, it wasn't like I decided I was going to be a teacher. I first, and this may sort of bleed into another question you have, but I first began teaching as an artist in residence at with the Vermont Council on the Arts. And so I would go around to different schools, mostly around in the area, and conduct woodworking classes. We would make wooden masks, or we'd make, sometimes kids wanted to make stilts. So I would lead kids through the use of some hand tools and woodworking techniques. And it was something that I really enjoyed. I liked hanging out with kids and just doing stuff with kids. So that was my first inkling that was something that was of interest to me. And by that time, I had already been a furniture maker for at least a decade. So, I mean, not really a decade, but I think in 1980, from 1980 to 1984, I think, is when I was on the Vermont Council on the Arts and teaching. So that was my first teaching experience.
When did you begin teaching, and how did you come to be a classroom teacher at the Marlboro School?
By 1988, I decided that I was going to get a teacher's certificate, get licensed to be a teacher. And so I had to go over to Keene State College to take some education classes because my degree was in Italian, and so it wasn't really entirely what was needed. But so I went over to Keene and took some classes, and then it ended up that I was able to do, because in order to be licensed, you have to do what's called a practicum, or practice teaching. You've had practice teachers in your classes at the elementary school, and I was a practice teacher in the 5th and 6th grade, the same classroom that I taught in for those many years. So that's where I did my internship. Then it just happened that the woman that I was working with there, Connie Barton, was also the principal of the school, but she felt like it was too much for her to be the principal and a full-time classroom teacher. So she decided during the time that I was interning with her that she wanted to be half-time classroom teacher and then half-time principal. So I applied for the job and was hired. And so I started teaching there in 1989, in the fall of 1989, at the age of 39 years old.
How long did you teach at MES?
For 26 years. That's a long time.
Was the shift from being a furniture maker in your studio to being a classroom teacher at MES a difficult one?
No, it really wasn't, because in many respects, well, first of all, and I don't mean this like, I don't know, I really enjoyed teaching. It was fun. I could only think of maybe a handful of days during that 26 years where I thought, oh God, I don't want to be doing this. almost always it was engaging. The fact that it's such a, particularly at that age level, the fact that it's so variable, that it changes from day to day, from week to week, from year to year, that kept me engaged in the process. Would you restate the question, please?
Was the shift from being a furniture...
Okay, got it. It really wasn't, because I think what I found was that, because when you're making things, what you're doing is problem solving. You're trying to figure out how to create something you see in your mind in a physical thing. So that if I need to make a table or something like that, I have to figure out how to do it. I have to problem solve. I've got these materials, I have to put them together to create this thing. In the classroom, a teacher's doing the same kind of thing. It's still problem solving, but you're dealing with different things. So you're trying to figure out what's the best way to help either the whole class, or what's the best way to help this student understand this material. And it's different with every kid. So that the problem solving is, in many respects, much more complex than making a piece of furniture or something like that, because every kid is different, and that's in part what made it a challenge and fun.
How did your work as a teacher impact your artistic work and vice versa?
I don't know. I don't know that I can answer that question. I feel in many respects as though because the thing is that during the time that I was teaching, I was also working in the shop. It wasn't like I stopped woodworking during that time. What it did mean is that I didn't have time, like I didn't have any gallery shows, a couple maybe, during that time that I taught. Mostly I worked on commissioned furniture. People would hire me to make them something. Being a full-time teacher meant that I didn't have full-time time to devote to woodworking. In some respects, I feel like they each complemented the other, so that coming into the studio and being sort of not talking and not teaching and not doing all the stuff that a teacher has to do was restful, and it was rejuvenating. Just like for you guys, when you do something other than be students, it helps you to get charged up for the next time you're going to do student things. So I guess if anything, I would say that they each were complementary to the other, both woodworking and being a teacher in the classroom. And in that respect, I would say they inform each other.
How would you describe the general teaching philosophy of M&S?
The Marlboro School is quite for a public school, it's quite unique. The kinds of things that the kids do at the Marlboro School are not the kind of things that kids in most other public schools are able to do. It's true that in a private school you might do some of those things, but the kinds of experiences that kids have at the Marlboro School is unique to public school education. And I would say that much of the general philosophy is experiential learning and project-based learning, rather than lots of workbooks and nothing but workbooks. And so I would say experiential and in-depth as opposed to superficial. Like when you have to, when what you do is based on bubble tests and tests that are more like Trivial Pursuit, then that's kind of shallow education. But when what you do is spend 6 weeks or 4 weeks studying one area of knowledge and you go into it in depth rather than superficially, you don't cover as much material, but you learn how to learn and learn skills that will help you in any field of study, whether it's learning how to fix your... I don't know, Ben, what do you think?
It's interesting.
So Ben says it's interesting. I don't know, I always, in a way, and it wasn't like I planned this, so I didn't ever really study how to be a teacher. I would say, I guess my own feeling about it is that I always respected, like I found many times that teachers, not at the Marlboro School, but teachers in other schools and other parts of the country, and sort of the politicians and government people don't really respect kids, don't really respect that kids are naturally curious and want to know about stuff. Their attitude is, we're going to tell them what to learn, and we're going to tell them how to learn it, and we're going to make sure that they get all the bubble tests done. And I find that, and always have found that, very disrespectful. In my experience, kids do like to learn, they do like to figure out things, and so for much of the work that I did, there would be almost like two parts. So let's say it's a big study. Let's say we're studying astronomy. There'll be part of an astronomy unit that everybody in the class will study, and it's kind of the basics of astronomy. Because what I need to do is to introduce the vocabulary of astronomy so that everybody understands in the reading that they're doing what the words mean and how they relate to the subject. And so there'd be the kind of work that everybody in the class would do. But then each student would have his or her own individual research project. And it might be life on another planet, aliens. It might be astrology, or it might be the moon, or it might be robotics in space. And that was always the student's choice of what they were going to study. And I wanted to believe that made it all more interesting for the students.
Have you always taught 5th and 6th grades, or have you also taught other age levels?
I taught a semester of Italian at Marlboro College, so I have taught college. And I've done arts workshops and things like that for high school kids, but mostly the focus has been on 10 to 12-year-olds who are the 5th and 6th graders. And it's because kids who are 10 to 12 understand irony, they understand sarcasm, but they don't yet think that everything sucks. That kind of happens in junior high. But I will say this, it happens less at the Marlboro School than it happens at other middle schools, in part because of the respect that kids are shown at the Marlboro School, so they don't feel like the teachers are their enemies, that they're friends.
What kept you interested in teaching 10 to 12-year-olds?
I kind of just answered that, but I guess I would say too that I also felt as though there was never anything that you couldn't study. So, in a way, because at the Marlboro School, I was allowed to teach really whatever I wanted. It meant that students in my classes studied things that kids in other 5th and 6th grades around, at least in the area, never studied. Like we studied atomic theory, we studied astrophysics, we studied biology and nanotechnology, so just in the sciences. And then in literature we read Homer's Odyssey, like the real book. We read Ray Bradbury, science fiction. We read like sophisticated, like Edward Conan Doyle. We read Sherlock Holmes and studied that and learned about the mystery genre. So, and these are things that were not really in the curriculum at the supervisory union. So there's the school district, Marlboro School, and then there's the supervisory union, which is all the schools in the area, many of them. And they had a set curriculum, but I never followed it. In some areas, it wasn't like I was not teaching the kind of math that needed to be taught. We just did it in a different way, and in some respects it was more sophisticated and I think challenging for the students, such that, well, I don't know, I've had students who have come back to me and said, for example, when we were studying genetics, this young lady who's just about to get her PhD in animal husbandry at UVM, or no, she's in Canada, in Ontario, I think. She came back and she was talking to me about Punnett squares, which she had first learned about in 6th grade, and then suddenly in college they're doing Punnett squares again. Or like when we studied Chaucer, kids who are in college will come back to me and say, you know, in my college class I'm studying Chaucer and feel like I've already got a handle on what that's about. My grandson Leander is now reading Homer's Odyssey, and he's in high school. So I felt like we could study anything, and therefore it kept me interested in it. Like it was stuff that I thought was cool, and even though it might not be in the curriculum guide, I felt as though my job was to make it accessible to kids who were 10 to 12, in part because I knew that they could do it. And I knew that they could understand it if it was made available, accessible to them.
Do you think that students have changed during the time you taught?
I don't think students have changed, but I think that I think the environment has changed. So the kids who go to the elementary school are, you know, they're obviously, one kid is different from the other, but as a group, no, I don't think that kids are that much different. But I do think that the things around them, you know, like for example, you know, the technological parts of it, screens and all that sort of thing, that didn't really exist when I first started teaching. And over the course of the years, and don't get me wrong, I mean, I think that all of that stuff is great. I use it myself. It's a great teaching tool, but it's not a substitute for learning your times tables, for example, or for learning how to write a coherent sentence and paragraph. All the technology supports this. The technology should support what you're learning. It shouldn't be the thing you're learning, unless you're taking a class in Photoshop, in which case you first need to learn how to manipulate it. Then when you've learned that, then what are you going to do with it? So just learning Photoshop and not being able to apply it to something cool is like, so what?
What have some of your former students gone on to do in life?
Some are contractors, carpenters, farriers. A farrier is a person who shoes horses. She's a blacksmith. Rachel Lundstedt. I think she's married now, so her last name's not Lundstedt. But let's see, what else? Writers. A student from many years ago owns a bobblehead doll company. Oh, Gordon, I don't know if Michelle is here. Here's what I'd like you to do. Go in the house, go in this door, go into where the desktop computer is, go past that, and you'll see shelves against this wall. On your left wall case, there's a bobblehead doll of me.
Okay.
Would you, yeah, okay. Yeah, you can go out this door if you want, because then you can go in the front door there. Yeah, and this bobblehead doll is slightly terrifying, but this was made for me by a former student. Let's see, who else? I have another student who's a classics, teaches ancient Greek and Latin. You know, the full range of what people do.
What are some of the characteristics that an effective teacher should have?
Well, I guess I would go back to just saying respecting kids and respecting learning and how people learn. Because, well, here's an example, for example. In math, and to me math was one of the more difficult subject areas to teach, in part because for me as a kid, math was really difficult. I don't know why, and I didn't really like math as a kid, in part because it was difficult, and again, I can't explain why that was, but it kind of like just didn't make sense to me. And I know that for other students, other subjects do the same thing. You know, somebody might be really good at reading, can read all the words, but doesn't really understand what they mean, or has difficulty with that. That becomes something that they have to work harder at. And for me, that subject was math. So when the supervisory union would say, okay, everybody's going to be in the same, everybody in the 5th and 6th grade is going to use the same math book. And they're going to do the same tests, and they're going to do the same, and we're going to do it the same way, and we're going to study fractions for 1 week, then we're going to study ratios, then we're going to study whatever. I found that to be insulting. Because in my experience, kids learn at different rates. Kids learned at different rates and in different ways. And so to sort of standardize, this is the way we're going to do it, just didn't make sense to me. It made much more sense for kids to master something, let's say it's fractions or division. The kids have to understand that before they're ready to go on to start to talk about ratios and percentages and things like that. math, you have to learn incrementally, and everything depends on everything else, in a way that not all subjects do. And so, to me, it was important that a student feel comfortable with something before turning the page and moving into a different subject. Maybe not master, but have enough grasp of the subject to be able to move into the next thing, and then maybe come back to it or something like that. We now have the bobblehead doll. This was made for me by Darby Brigham. Looks funny, it looks like me. Are you saying I look funny? Anyway, that was pretty amusing. Okay, what's your next question, Roxanne?
Who were your more important mentors or role models as teachers?
I would say one of the most important role models and founders, really, of the Marlboro School, and for it being the way it is in Wilmington, and taught at the Marlboro School for, I don't know, maybe 30 years, and was the principal. It was really his vision of education that was the basis for the kind of school that the Marlboro School is. And I should add that his vision, he was a graduate of Marlboro College, and Marlboro College's attitude toward education was that it was very personal and immersive. And by immersive, I mean going deep, not broad. So we go deep into medieval European history, and not superficially talking about a million different things. So Bruce Cole, for sure, and then Connie Barton. Connie Barton was the woman that I did my internship with. Well, you know, down at the school, that totem pole that's down there in the next to the bridge. That's a project that I made, or what's the piece in the library, on the wall there in the library. Those are two things that I made when Connie Barton was the principal, that I came down and did with students. And she was the 5th and 6th grade teacher, and also the teaching principal. She's the woman that I did my student teaching with. She was a brilliant educator and an important teacher for me.
What were the more challenging aspects of teaching? Did they change over the years?
Well, in many respects, I would say the most challenging parts were the interference that we got from the federal government, the state government, and the local supervisory union. So I would say outside interference was the most difficult part. Because I mean, obviously with any time I've had hundreds of students, and I feel as though I've gotten along well with 98% of them, 99% of them. There are always kids that have, one of the things about a public school is you take anybody who shows up, anyone who lives in town who shows up, and what that means is you get a variety of students, and they're coming from a variety of backgrounds and have a variety of attitudes which they bring to the school and to the classroom. And in most cases, no matter what their background was, I felt that I was able to make a connection with kids in one way or another. Some stronger than others. That's just natural. We all have people that we feel sort of more comfortable with than others. I will say too that there were some kids that, with whom at the time that I was their teacher, that I, had difficult sort of personality clashes with, who as they've gotten to be adults, I'm very friendly with. So there are always those challenges, but the biggest challenges were the challenges that came from outside the school community and outside the town.
What were your favorite subject areas? Which were more challenging or difficult for you?
Well, as I said, at least initially, math was challenging for me. Although I must say it was only through teaching it that I came to appreciate the elegance of math. And now, even though I still don't feel as though I'm a particularly good math teacher, I do certainly know 5th and 6th grade math. And in some respects, I feel like that I was a good math teacher for a lot of kids who also struggled with it. Because in order for me to understand the ideas or the concept, I had to understand what it was about it that I didn't understand, and had to figure out coping mechanisms or ways to understand it so that I could explain it to somebody who also didn't understand it. And so in that respect, I certainly have come to appreciate, if not love, math. My favorite subjects were always in the sciences and the social studies and literature and writing.
Can you describe some of the long-standing traditions that you have upheld in your classroom, such as the Canterbury Tales or reading science fiction while studying astronomy?
In a sense, I think this goes back to going deep into a subject rather than dealing with it superficially. So when we would study medieval Europe, and that was actually part of a longer study of studying migration, well, maybe I'll use this as an example. In the years, because every other year we would go for field research to a different place. One year it would be Cape Cod, and that was generally in the fall, and the other year it would be to New York City. The New York City trip, the big subject was U.S. immigration history, and in order to get at that, we needed to study the immigration history of the world, really. And so we began in Africa and moved to China, came across the Silk Road into the Mideast, up to Europe. And so we're studying the Silk Road and studying things along the way, not in great depth, but just to get a sense of the movement of people over the millennia. And then when we got to Europe, we stayed there for a while, because American culture is certainly changing for the better, but American culture is still primarily European, Eurocentric, or European-based. That's changing, and that's a good thing. So we would pause in Europe and study things in Europe. So during that time, for social studies or history, students would be selecting a project that they wanted to study, having to do with medieval history or culture. And so kids would decide to study siege engines like catapults and trebuchets, or castles, or what else, Ben?
I did swords.
Okay, Ben studied swords. So there was a variety of things that Joan of Arc, and no matter what it was. At the same time that we were doing that, we also were reading Chaucer. Chaucer was a medieval English poet, Middle English era, like 1380 or so. and we would read the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, which the Canterbury Tales is his most known work. And so that was one. But then we would move on from studying medieval Europe to immigration from Europe to the United States, to America. So that would bring us to looking at the migration of Native Americans into North America. Then we would start to talk about the Europeans and moving to North America. And then we would begin to study specifically United States immigration history from about, I don't know, from about 1700 to about 1950, let's say, or 45. And that was a long project. So basically that's something that that study would happen over the course of several months, like from sometimes December until April. But because it was so varied, we studied lots of other things along the way, but with the focus for me as the person who's like guiding what we're doing, for me I'm always thinking, okay, this is gonna end in New York, and it's gonna end with going to Ellis Island and to the Tenement Museum and the early 20th century history of immigration in this country.
Can you still recite the first stanza of the prologue to the Canterbury Tales?
Can you bet?
Wonders fruit sorosota.
Okay, I'll do it and then you'll remember a lot of it. So it goes, Juan that April with his shore sota, the drukta of March had perset to the rota, and bather every vein and sweetly cour, of which virtue engendered is the floor. Juan Zephyris echo with sweat of breath, inspired hath in every holten head the tender croppies, and the youngest son hath in the ram his halve course runna. En smale voele smaak en melodie, dat slepen al de niks with open ear, so pricketh him na koens near courages. Dan along and folk to gone on pilgrimages and palmerers for to saken strongest rondes, tofen always couth in sundry londes. And specially from every sheer's end of England to Canterbury they wend, the hale blessful martyr for to sake, that him hath holpen when that they were sick. Now I know that Ritter, you heard that more than once, and I know that you did too, Roxanne. And Ben had to learn it and recite it.
It's been like 3 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that's amazing to me about that is that there are kids who are in college, who or you know, out of college, who can still recite that. To me, that's impressive.
It's a very catchy thing to remember.
And it scans as a rap. So it's possible to do it as a rap. I don't think I'll do that for you right now, but I did. There is a recording somewhere of me doing it as a rap.
Didn't we do that for All Schools Sing?
We did do that.
We did.
You guys did.
Yeah, we did.
Please talk about your annual field research trips. How did they begin? What were some of the important educational reasons for the trips? Okay.
Yeah, I talked a little about the New York trip, aspects of it. So let me just say a few more things about that, and then maybe talk about the Cape Cod thing. In many respects, their purpose and the scope of what kids did was the same. So going back to where I was saying that everybody would, there'd be a certain amount of content that everybody would study. So everybody would study about the Chinese Exclusion Act and other elements of U.S. history, immigration history. But when we would go to New York, each student chose his or her own individual research project. And then my job and Gordon's job on the few times that he came with us were to get kids to interviews. So every student had to interview somebody connected with that field, a professional in that field. So I know that Ben went to Rockefeller Center and studied and interviewed a security guy there.
Security guard, yeah.
So Ben has an opportunity to go and talk to this person who knows a tremendous amount about Rockefeller Center and about the aspect of being in Rockefeller Center that he knows a lot about. Gordon, who did you took?
I took Jeremiah
and Roxanne's brother to Cyrus, thank you. I was blanking on there.
Museum of Science?
To the Museum of Natural History is where he went, and met with a curator there to discuss each of their topics. And I think Jeremiah's was underground water systems, natural water systems in Manhattan, and Cyrus was studying the geology. For example, in thinking about the landscape design. So I had a student who was interested in landscape design of Central Park. So we managed to find the guy and the head of landscape design, and he agreed to give us 10 minutes. That's all I had time for. So we said, fine, we'll take it. When we arrived there, he said, well, I've got a little more time than I thought I might. I can give you half an hour. So we said, great. And so I stayed for introductions and helping Jesse Lapata get set up, and then I left and came back in a half an hour, and they now had maps of Central Park from 1820, original maps laid out, and they're looking at them, and this guy's explaining stuff about the evolution of the landscaping in Central Park. I saw that they were busy. I said, okay, I'll come back in half an hour. They said, fine. Came back in a half an hour. They were up to 1920 or something like that. I'm making that up. But they were still looking at these maps and still talking to each other about what was going on. At that point, I couldn't leave because we had to go. We had to meet the rest of the group. But what I noticed was, as soon as I was present, the guy stopped talking to the student, Jesse, and started talking to me. And I thought, that's why it's important for me not to be there. It's like when we're doing this project, we get you guys set up, and then we leave, so that you're interacting with whoever the person is directly. And notice this, and I know that you will. You'll be with one of your parents somewhere, and you'll encounter somebody that you know, and they know you, and you've had lots of conversations with them, an adult. You're standing there, and that adult, may say, hi, Roxanne, but that person's not going to talk to you. They're going to talk to the parent, even if it's something that relates to you. You're standing there like chopped liver, and you're one of your parents and this other person are talking about you as if you weren't there. It's because in a sense this goes back to the way kids are treated. I don't want to get off on that again. Anyway, so it was always important for me to leave when these interviews were taking place so that the interaction could happen between the expert in the field and the student, and not me there. And the same thing with the Cape. The focus on the Cape trip, we would go down and stay at the Coast Guard station in Eastham, and we would be down there for a week. And there we would be studying the ecology of the Cape. The focus was more on natural science and history, and a little bit in geology, but mostly natural science and history of Cape Cod. And again, students would have interviews. They might talk to a person who was involved in dolphin rescue, the dolphin rescue organizations, or they might talk to the windmiller at the windmill in Eastham. You remember who you talked to, Ben?
Where is this?
Out at the Cape?
I didn't go to Cape Cod.
Oh, so you were just in 6th grade?
I was in Paris.
I see.
Well, yeah, I was just in 6th.
Right. So that's kind of how that worked, and it was a similar sort of thing where I would go for the interview with the kid, meet the person, and then leave, and then come back again.
Was there ever any resistance from parents or the school board to the trips?
Definitely not the school board. They were very supportive of, both for the idea of it, recognizing the educational value, and supporting it with money. For parents, very little. Occasionally there'd be a parent who'd be anxious about letting their child go to New York City, feeling that New York City was dangerous, and it's probably in part because they themselves didn't really have much experience with New York City, so that there would be some anxiety around that. On the other hand, there would be parents who would sign up a year in advance to say, when you're going down to New York, I want to go. And so I've always felt as though I had a lot of support from parents.
What are some of the more memorable events while on a field research trip?
There are lots. Just for brevity, I'll just talk about one of them. This was one of the second time I think, I took kids down to the Cape. It was in the early 90s, and let's see, Selena Romo was in the class, and obviously other kids. And there was a hurricane. It was called the perfect storm. There was a storm that came up the East Coast. There was a storm that was coming from the west, and there was a storm that was coming down out of the northeast, and they all met off Cape Cod. This was the most unbelievable storm I'd ever seen. It was incredible. And it got so intense that the Coast Guard came, because the place that we stayed in Eastham was 200 yards from the Atlantic Ocean and 50 yards from Nauset Bay on Coast Guard Beach. And the building was fine, but we had to cross a couple different bridges in order to get to this building. And the Coast Guard came and said, you guys gotta go. You'll be safe in this house. We're not worried about that, because the Coast Guard building had been built in the 1800s. It had seen a lot of hurricanes. But the Coast Guard was worried about the two bridges that we had to cross. And so they said, if you would leave, we'd really appreciate it, because we have enough to worry about without also having to worry about 25 people in this house. So if you would go, that would be terrific. And we'll give you a long weekend in the spring for free. Because this was like maybe day 2 or the morning of day 3 we left. And indeed, by the end of that day, the bridge that we would have had to take was gone.
What other field research activities did you do with your students? Ones that were more local?
The more local ones involved going up to, first we started off here and then moved up to Hogback. And this was a Vermont natural history study in which groups of 3 or 4, sometimes 5 students would choose a 3 meter by 3 meter plot of ground, and then they had to make a field guide to that plot, which meant that there were lots of different aspects, taking temperature, learning Latin nomenclature so that they could identify and make drawings of the various plants, mostly plants, but also animals, insects and salamanders and whoever else came into that 3 meter by 3 meter plot. In a sense, the big question was, who lives here? And so the job of the team putting together they had to name their plot, and they also had to create this field guide for it. The other, well, I did it early on. I would take kids out and we would interview people, but I think you're going to ask me another question about work in Marlboro, so maybe I'll. The natural history one having to do with the ecology of Vermont was one that we would, and that would be a 6-week to 2-month study. We would say, I'll just refer back to hogback. We would go up to hogback 2 times a week for several hours. Like we might go up there all of Tuesday afternoon and all of Thursday afternoon, so that kids could work on their plots, and they had to do mapping, and really an involved process. And the field guides they made are spectacular. So the thing about all these field research projects is they take a lot of time. And in most schools, teachers and students aren't given that time. At the Marlboro School, the value of the fact that learning anything well takes a lot of time takes I don't say a lot of time, but it takes time to do anything well. A lot of practice and a lot of repeated examination.
We are interviewing you as part of the community history project called Work in Marlboro. Would you explain a bit about how it began and evolved?
I think it was maybe 2003, but definitely 2004. Jean Boardman, who was she was sort of a liaison between the Marlboro Historical Society and my classroom, said to me, "Do you want to do a natural history, a community history project?" And I said, it sounded good. So we discussed it and talked about different possibilities, but then came up with the idea that kids would go out and interview people who both live and work in Marlboro. And so that began in 2004 as we went around and interviewed people. Many of the people that we interviewed in the early days, say 04, 5, 6, 7, some of those people are no longer alive. They were older people at the time and they have since died. So that the record that we have of those people talking about their life and work in town is a valuable historical record. Do you have another question about that?
I don't think so.
Let me just say then that here again the school board was very supportive, the school was very supportive, parents were very supportive, and Kelly Salison at some point, I don't know what year it was, 05 or 6, or I don't know, she wrote a grant, and I was awarded this $2,000 grant, and so that meant that I was able to start to get some better equipment than we had at first. And so we have continually tried to improve the quality of the equipment that we have. after I retired, then Gordon Morse and I continued with the project as an after-school program. So now it's once a week, and for whatever kids feel like they want to do it.
In 2014, you were awarded the Vermont Council on the Humanities Teacher of the...
Yes, in 2014, the Vermont Humanities Council awarded me the Humanities Teacher of the Year. It's weird, isn't it? Yeah, and that was, I think that came about in part because of the field research trips and the community research things that I had done over the years. And also, I know that one of the people who nominated me, or who like, I know Francie Marbury wrote a letter of support to the Vermont Humanities Council, and Susan Calabria, who is the education director at the Brattleboro Museum, also. I don't know if other people did as well, but I know those two people wrote to nominate me and wrote in support of me. I had also done a number of how to teach math using art, sort of workshops for teachers down at the museum. And so that was another reason why Susan Calabria was supporting my nomination for that award. And I got it. It was wonderful.
You are known by your students as an engaging storyteller. Can you tell a story that was a favorite of your classes over the years?
Well, of course, I could tell the Greek ferry boat story, but that's a little too long. You don't want to throw up again, Ben?
No.
All right, I think what I'll do is tell this story about a student. This was like in, I don't know, probably 1978. And you two guys may hear this story again, and you, Sean, soon. You might. I was a school bus driver, and at that time, my hair was red, for one thing, and down to about here. I had red hair and a red beard. Yeah, hard to believe. Now I have barely any hair and a very handsome goatee. At any rate, so I was a school bus driver and had, as I said, had really long hair. BJ was in kindergarten, and he was he at that time was one of those. Now he's like, I don't know, 6'3" and is a big strapping guy. But at that time he was about as wide as he was tall, and he was in kindergarten. And it was the first week of school. He was looking at me the whole time. It's like, this is weird. This is really weird. He'd get on in the morning, and then when he'd get off the bus, he'd be looking at me, and so finally, after the first full week of school, he made it so that he was the last one off the bus. And he said to me, "David, why do you have long hair?" And he had hair kind of like mine, a sort of a buzz cut. And I said, "Well, BJ, why do you have short hair?" And he said, "Well, because I don't want to look like a girl." And I said, "BJ, you think I look like a girl?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, how many girls do you know with beards?" And he paused for a second and looked at me and said, "Just you." So that was a pretty funny story. BJ had lots of things to say to me. Some are more X-rated than this one. Hey Sean, every time you move that, everybody hears it, so it'd be better to just not. Thanks.
Oh, David, the battery looks like it's about to die on the camera right here. It's like flashing this like battery.
How many more questions do you have, Roxanne?
4.
Alright, try power through.
Yeah, we'll try that.
You are
There
now.
might be another battery in the, well, we're gonna run out of time anyway, go ahead.
You are now a member of the Marlboro School Board. Why did you decide to run for the board?
I decided to run for the board because of Act 46. Act 46 is a law passed by the Vermont legislature that I'm not going to sort of give my opinion about it, except that I think it's not a good fit for the Marlboro School. There was some discussion around the Marlboro School merging with the Dover School and the Wardsboro School to create one school district, which would mean that the Marlboro School would no longer be able to be the kind of school it is. It would change. The field research that we do, none of those other schools do. The way in which we teach is different than it is at those other schools. It would have, I think, been a bad idea for the Marlboro School and for the town of Marlboro. And so I ran to get elected to the school board to firstly help the school board defeat the vote that the town had, and we succeeded at that. There were 66 people who thought we should merge with Dover and Wardsboro, and there were 264 who said we should not merge. So that part worked out well. Now, I feel as though my role on the school board is to, in whatever way I can, help to make it so that the Marlboro School exists as the kind of school that it has historically been.
What has that been like for you? Is it what you expected? Is it a satisfying experience?
It's a lot of meetings. I mean, it certainly was satisfying that we were able to help the town to see that merging was not a good idea for the town. There have been a lot of meetings, and you know, that's understandable. That's what goes with the territory. As for what I thought it would be, I don't know that I thought anything. And we're still in the process of doing this, if we're able to help the school to maintain its autonomy, then it will have been successful, and the effort put into it by many people will have paid off.
Would you speak a bit about your involvement in town government and other community events? The fair, the summer sale, town meeting, etc.
In town, I've been a justice of the peace in town for 20-some years. That means that I sit on the board of tax abatement, I sit on the board of civil authority, which is an elected position I have to run every 2 years. At the summer sale, for the last 3 or 4 years, Dave Roundtree and I are help with the selling of things, at the Marlboro Alliance summer sale. I've also, for the last, I don't know how many years, been the beer and wine judge at the Marlboro Fair. Now, for the first, 12 or 15 years of the fair, I was the MC. And then Andy Reichman took over, and he's been the MC since, and that meant that I could go and be the beer and wine judge.
Is there anything else about your life or work that you'd like to mention that I haven't asked you about?
I think the questions were extensive, and it probably is, but I can't think of it right now.
Okay, thank you very much for your time.
It was a pleasure.
All right.
Sean?
Yeah.
Are you shooting still, Sean?
Yeah.
Okay, so you use that. The other one is broken. It's really,
Bottom thing.
I know, it's such a nuisance.
Sean, can you move for a second?
Now, Ritter, the only thing, I said you could touch it, you just need to be gentle. Look like you're kind of tight there, Ben.
Don't worry, I'll make it.
You also do burgers for humans. All right. So
Ritter, you're on
What?
audio?
Yes, audio, yes.
Okay, get out the audio equipment. I will help you set it up.
I kind of forget how to do everything
That's what I'm saying, I'll help you.
Oh, this is audio, right?
this is audio.
This is audio, right?
These two things are audio.
Ah, okay. I knew that there were two objects.
Screw these things, you'll see that you can, you know how that works.
And also this.
No.
All this is audio.
Can I go in here, David?
Absolutely.
Where's the still camera?
No, it's in the bag.
Is there any more out here that I need to record?
Pretty good.
Alright, cool.